You're tuned in to the Andrew Lawton Show.
Justin Trudeau and Vice President Kamala Harris yesterday had their first official conversation. They spoke about diversity and inclusion. They spoke about climate change. They spoke about all sorts of things, even online hate, but not the giant cancellation of the Keystone XL pipeline, which is jeopardizing jobs in both of the leaders' countries and costing billions of dollars. The Keystone XL pipeline apparently no longer a priority, which makes me wonder who's speaking up for the Alberta jobs, the Saskatchewan jobs, the effect of the Canadian economy. Very few people at the federal level. One man who has always spoken up about these things and the importance of the Canadian energy sector is Michael Binnion, the executive director of the Modern Miracle Network, who joins me now. Michael, good to talk to you. Thanks for coming on today.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Andrew.
You know, one of the things that I find to be the most upsetting about this is that we saw the federal government prepare to move mountains when Quebec jobs were in jeopardy with SNC-Lavalin a couple of years ago. But when we talk about the oil sector, which is not just Alberta, but it is a national sector, very few people advocating for Canadian jobs in this area.
Yes. Yeah. Of course, we do have a government in Alberta that does advocate for that, and others across the country. But certainly, our federal government I think we've heard the Prime Minister talk about the Great Reset, and I noticed in the readout from the summary of the conversation with the Vice President that they explicitly talked about Build Back Better. So, both Build Back Better and Great Reset slogans include a leave it in the ground component and switching to other forms of energy.
One thing that I find just the most bizarre about the Keystone cancellation, which was done by executive order from Joe Biden on his first day in office as president, is that this wasn't actually about some idea, some project that was still stuck in R&D. This was construction already began, and the cross-border section, which is arguably the most contentious section of the pipeline, literally in the ground.
Yeah, the one thing, and of course we haven't seen from the Prime Minister bringing up either the legal side of this, which is, there was an approval given, there was a permit, and people in good faith on both sides of the borders, the Canadian company in particular, TC Energy, and the government of Alberta, all relied on the agreement of the U.S. government. So that there's that one side. The other thing we haven't seen from the Prime Minister is a defense of our environmental record. I mean, a lot has changed since the Vice President was, or since the President was last Vice President and last in office. I mean, that was 4 years ago plus. And it's incredible the environmental progress that's been made, on that pipeline in particular, in the industry in general. And our Prime Minister, as I said, didn't speak up for us on just a second, there was an agreement here, and how can you cancel it? Not just that there was an agreement, we've already put billions of dollars into construction under that agreement. How can you do that just under a rule of law and rule of international law? Our NAFTA agreements, our former NAFTA agreements, I think still apply to some of this. And on the other side, just a second, why would you want to do it? We've got best in the world environmental performance here.
Yeah, and that's, I think, the most disingenuous part of this, is that the narrative that's been put forward by the Biden administration and by a lot of the people that have been very anti-pipeline is that you get pipelines or you get environmental policy, and that the two are inherently contradictory, which I've never quite understood, because ending a pipeline does not reduce demand on oil. It just reduces supply. But the supply has got to get there some other way, so you see tankers, you see rail, you see other means of transporting oil that are less environmentally sound than a pipeline.
This is so we know that there's more to the motivations of people when you do see best in the world environmental performance, incredible progress on emissions intensity. A pipeline, for the first pipeline, I think, that was going to use 100% renewable energy to run the pipeline. I mean, this would have been a world leading example of a low emissions pipeline. I mean, if people really did care about energy, transitioning our energy systems globally to something better in the future. They would want that. They would be celebrating what Canadians are doing as best in the world environmental performance, reducing emissions, and not taking the best in the world off the market only so the worst in the world can sell more. And the net effect can only be more emissions. So how can they where's the logic if we're doing this to reduce environmental impacts, but the impact of this is going to actually be increased global environmental impacts?
Yeah, and I guess that's where even the narrative that they put forward as being the justification for this doesn't really hold water. But at the very least, we're talking about a level of employment that is desperately needed right now. I mean, this is now a government signing a death warrant for jobs at a time when private sector jobs are already facing immense strain because of the COVID pandemic.
Yeah, and I think we see this from the Trudeau government too. I really had thought when with the pandemic crisis, which has affected all of us so much, right? We would see a return to pragmatism. What's the best way to solve the pandemic crisis in the short term, but also to help people get back to work? I mean, this is families across the country who've been hurt, and many of them losing life savings, et cetera. So let's how do we get them back to work? And instead of a return to pragmatism, it seemed to be what a great opportunity to double down on ideology, and what a great opportunity for us to convince people to destroy an industry, to destroy a whole sector of jobs. So it's a surprise. I would go so far as to say I was a little bit shocked even that we didn't see a return to a pragmatic approach and have Canadians all come together. Let's solve this crisis together. And we've talked about it. We're all in this together. I mean, people meet that we're all in this together. Well, if we're all in this together, why are we destroying an industry with world-leading performance, or working together with the U.S. government to destroy an industry with world-leading performance? Makes no sense. But it is an example of it's ideology over pragmatism.
When you say ideology, though, that is, I think, very telling, because this is not just against pipelines, but it's actually a fundamental rejection of oil as a source of energy. But they don't have an alternative. I mean, even the renewables they talk about, like, solar and wind, I mean, these are not things that are capable of doing what oil and gas are. So is there actually a what comes next to the activists that are trying to go after pipelines?
Yeah, well, I guess I look at it and say, well, would it be possible for one country, Germany, Denmark, Canada, one of the rich G7 or OECD countries, say, well, we're going to go off oil as a demonstration to the world of an ideology, so on and so forth. I mean, so okay, well, that seems like maybe that's possible, but if we're looking at this we truly look at this, we've got a global issue of emissions, and we've got a global issue of population growth, and all of the impacts that has on our environment. How do we manage that better globally? Well, then this makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. Our industry in Canada, are coming up with real world solutions that will make the global problem better. And we have a government saying, no, we just want to see lower emissions in Canada. We don't care if that would cause higher emissions globally. We just want lower emissions in Canada. I wrote a paper on this, effect called carbon leakage. Very simply, carbon leakage is when your policies at home reduce emissions here, but the net effect is you actually just move them somewhere else and the emissions go up. So it's also referred to as a green paradox. But Canada's living it. We're implementing policies like our seeming cooperation with the Americans on canceling this pipeline. We're implementing policies here that may reduce emissions here, but they will cause global emissions to, on a net basis, go up, because as you mentioned, that oil is going to be replaced by someone. The U.S. refineries in that part of the world will. Their other two options are Mexico and Venezuela. Is there anybody that thinks that the environmental performance of Mexico and Venezuela is better than ours?
Yeah, you raise, I think, a really important point there, and it is interesting because we hear all the time that we can't have local solutions to climate change and emissions because these are global problems. It's a global phenomena, but the reality reality is that countries are competing with each other, even within countries. States are competing with other states. Provinces are competing with other provinces to be competitive. So if a country does do this whole utopian idea, take the Paris Climate Agreement and follow through with those plans and go above and beyond, all that really does is allow for someone else to be the beneficiary of these jobs. And it's not to say that countries should do nothing, but I think there needs to be a lot more celebration of the point that you've raised, Michael, which is how much the private sector has already advanced on these issues, much quicker than, I would add, many governments have.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And you know what I would say as well is, I think people in industry, and I'll count myself, among those people, but some of the bigger companies, Suncor, CNRL, et cetera, I think that they have really embraced this idea that we do need to transition our energy systems, but on a realistic basis, looking at the global problem of supplying global energy to a growing population. They've realized that that future energy mix is going to include hydrocarbons, and which is not to say we should be against wind, right? Right energy in its right place. In some places, that's wind. In some places, it's hydro, nuclear, solar. And as technology changes, the right energy in its right place will change as well. But, I think a lot of people are recognizing that solar and wind, the technology is advancing quickly. We're all hearing about that all the time. What seems to be going unnoticed is that I think the oil and gas industry is innovating even faster. We're under pressure to provide a product that people have come to rely on. It's I think an excellent product from its just physical components and what it can do, for whether making plastics for hospitals or compact energy for transportation. But we've been making unbelievable progress on reducing the emissions, and I don't want to ramble on here. But the other thing people are not talking about is some of the advances on the consumption side. So I'll make a little bit of a bold statement just for effect here, but it's possible that oil and gas is closer to zero emissions than solar and wind. Now, I'll explain that point because it's a bit of a bold statement.
Please.
But the reason for that is that we're getting close to being able to capture carbon. We're finding ways to use CO2 as a feedstock for other products. So, my company and some other companies are getting close to zero emissions production. So, I've opened up a whole can of worms there, Andrew, and I don't want to ramble on, but I think people are not noticing just how amazing of solutions the private sector is coming up with. And I'm getting back to the point of ideology. I sometimes think that the people who are doing this for ideological reasons only want government solutions and in fact are unhappy with the fact that the private sector is coming up with solutions and maybe even better ones.
Yeah, because I know that if I were to bring up the point that you just raised about some of these innovations, people are going to discount it and not even want to hear it because, it's coming from an oil and gas company. And I've already seen just the comparisons that people make between oil and gas companies and others, just these big evil corporate overlords on these. But the reality is private sector solutions should be encouraged because the argument for a government response is only if a response can't come from anywhere else.
Right. Well, who's shocked that the private sector, if properly motivated, and of course that goes to what you said some of the opponents say, but if properly motivated, who's shocked that the market and private enterprise is better at coming up with technical solutions and for problems than the government is? Like, who's shocked by that? Hopefully, almost no one, right? But the question comes down to is the private sector actually properly motivated? And the people you refer to are saying, well, you guys only care about making profits, so why would you care about the environment? But I would make 2 points there. One is that the people that work in our industry, live. There's I think 800,000 people, 800,000 families across the country that rely on the oil and gas industry either for a direct job or an indirect job, and these people live across the country. They're people just like you, me, people listening to this show. They live in neighborhoods with us. So why would we think those people don't care about the environment just as much as you do? And these people work in our companies. I know them. Of course they do. They love to go hiking on the weekends too. So, but the other point is that I think it's become quite clear, and I want to give some credit to the environmental movement here, and you can distinguish in the environmental movement. There's those people who are I think genuine, and I think there's those people who are only caring about ideology. But there's been a lot of good people in the environmental movement who've made the case for why we have to care about this. They've made the case for why there has to be taxes and regulations on some of these issues. Industry and the market are just responding to those things. We're realizing now if we want to get investment, if we want to be profitable in a new world of higher regulation and taxes, well, we've responded to that. I don't think people are noticing just how fast that innovation's happening.
Michael Binnion, the executive director of the Modern Miracle Network, joins me. Michael, always a pleasure. Thanks for coming on and shining the light on this.
No, great. Anytime, Andrew. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.